Roger Waters versus Ozzy Osbourne. The 4.5-mile battle for Chuck Berry's legendary guitar. Picture this. Beneath the crystal chandeliers of Christie's Rockefeller Center, two rock legends face off over one guitar. Not just any guitar, the red Gibson ES-335 that first taught the world to run, riff, and dream. Tonight won't end with a gavel. Tonight, arrogance learns its greatest lesson and music remembers what it's for. Before we begin, if you love stories that pull the curtain back on legends, subscribe to Voices of Darkness, hit like, and share this with a friend. Help us hit 1,000 subscribers. Your support lets us keep telling the stories that matter. The Night the Guitar Spoke. New York, November 2018. Cold enough to make breath look like secrets. The revolving doors of Christie's exhaled donors, curators, heirs, and the kind of people who already had everything and came because they still felt a missing shape. The salon was a cathedral of glass and velvet. Frames of famous lives stared from the walls. A purple coat, a scuffed drumhead, a ticket stub from a night that refused to end. But at the center of the room, under light warm as honey, glowed a red Gibson ES-335. The plaque beneath it was modest. The story it held was not. A young technician polishing the case whispered, "It still smells like stage heat." He didn't know why he said it that way, only that it felt true. From the front row, Roger Waters, 75, impeccable in an Italian-cut suit, examined the room with the calm of a man who'd stared down stadiums. Next to him, Philip Thornton, historian and advisor, held a bidding paddle like a quiet confession. In the back, dressed like he'd come straight from soundcheck, black jeans, old t-shirt, carved-up leather, Ozzy Osbourne sat with Jimmy Chen, his longtime assistant who never stopped watching the room even when he blinked. "Jimmy," Ozzy murmured. "That's the one, yeah?" "The one," Jimmy said. "Chuck Berry's, the early one. The road-battered miracle." Ozzy's eyes softened, as if an old song had walked back into the room on its own legs. The auctioneer, Victoria Ashford, took the stage, elegance sharpened by an aura that said she'd flown through storms and still landed on time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the evening's most special lot, Chuck Berry's 1958 Gibson ES-335, the guitar that helped invent the freeway and rock and roll." Applause moved through the room like a wave finding shore. Roger didn't clap. He tilted toward Philip. "Grandiosity. It's a fine instrument with historical resonance, but sophistication lives elsewhere." He said sophistication like some people say sanctuary, or weapon. Back row. Ozzy closed his eyes. The riff crawled out of memory and into his bloodstream. A scatter of notes, a heel kick of rhythm, a red door opening somewhere in Birmingham, 1963. The gavel hovered. "We begin at $2 million. Roger's paddle rose, a gesture like a blade. 2.1. Ozzy's voice floated up from the back, low and calm. 2.2. A beat. The room smiled collectively. "This might be fun," Roger quickened. 2.5. Ozzy, unfussed. 2.7. 3, Roger said, and Philip leaned in, whispering something about ceilings and sanity that only made Roger sit taller. Victoria's voice was a metronome, steady, bright. 3 from Mr. Waters, 3-2 from Mr. Osbourne, 3-5, she paused, caught by the velocity of the air itself. From Mr. Waters. Extraordinary. Ozzy looked like a man deciding whether to rescue an old stray dog because it had chosen him. 3,750. A ripple of laughter, some startled, some delighted. The auction floor had turned into a stage without warning. Roger stood. His voice traveled with the roundness of theater. 4 million. A line had been drawn. People leaned forward, the act of witnessing reconfiguring their posture. Ozzy rose, walked slowly up the aisle. When he reached Roger's row, he paused, turned, and regarded the man whose albums had taught sorrow to build cathedrals. "Roger, mate," Ozzy said softly. "What does it mean to you?" Roger blinked. "It's a historic artifact. A milestone of—" "Not the museum talk," Ozzy said gently. "Your heart silence. Expensive, delicate." Philip looked at his shoes. Ozzy turned toward the case. "When I was 15 and a radio bled into the alley," he said, "that sound cut holes in the fence. I thought, maybe I'm not stuck forever. That guitar was a door where there wasn't one." He raised his hand. 4.5. Victoria's gavel descended like an answered prayer. Sold to Mr. Osbourne. Applause didn't just happen. It surged, it stood up, it admitted something it hadn't wanted to say. Ozzy didn't smile. Not yet. He kept looking at the red guitar, as if checking that it was breathing. Roger sat slowly like a tide that had just discovered the moon. Cocktails were poured like diplomacy. Waiters passed trays heavy with glassware and legend. Roger and Philip found a corner where the music couldn't quite reach. "I behaved like a fool," Roger said. He said it without heat, like a man describing the weather he had brought upon himself. Philip tried the door marked humility. "Perhaps you were determined." "Determination with a tuxedo," Roger said. "It looks like grace until it doesn't." Across the room, Ozzy stood by an open case. The tech handed him the ES-335 like an heirloom baby. Ozzy cradled the weight, felt the lacquer worn smooth where a thumb had once insisted its way through songs. Jimmy watched the old man's face alter, history unspooling, note by note. "Jimmy," Ozzy said, "you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The part that isn't sound." A photographer raised a lens and decided against it. Some moments take their own pictures. Soho, the next afternoon, a cafe that tried and failed to be invisible. Ozzy sat in the corner booth, the one that collected conversations that didn't want to be overheard. Roger arrived in a suit that could have won an election. Ozzy stood, grinned. "Sit, mate." They held their coffees like lifelines. Roger inhaled. "Ozzy, I owe you an apology." Ozzy waved it off. "We all owe each other a song we forgot to sing." Roger stared at the table, at the hairline crack in the wood. "I wanted to own it." "And what would it own of you?" Ozzy asked. They watched the window for a while. The world kept rehearsing itself. Ozzy opened his phone and pressed play. The screen filled with a stage, an audience, a boy in a chair with wheels and eyes that had found the sun. Ozzy's voice on tape, rough and generous. "You sing, kid." "I'll follow." Roger listened. You could see the architecture shifting behind his eyes. "Music's not a trophy case," Ozzy said. "It's a bridge. We don't build them to stand on and wave. We build them so people can cross." "What'll you do with it?" Roger asked, already suspecting the answer. "Give it away," Ozzy said simply. "Rock Hall. Put it where the kids can see their faces in the red." Roger flinched at the sudden grace. $4.5 million. Ozzy shrugged. "I spent worse on being stupid." They laughed. Two men whose laughter had learned nuance late. "Play a concert there," Ozzy added, eyes twinkling. "Chuck Berry night. Pay it forward." Roger thought of all the times he turned classrooms into arenas and arenas into confessionals. He nodded. "I'll do it." 3 months is a curious distance, long enough to turn an impulse into a plan, short enough to keep the heart from forgetting. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame cleared a space you could walk into but not fully fill. Curators argued lovingly about angles of light. Insurance people invented new ways to swallow. The ES-335 arrived in a crate that had crossed continents and decades to be here. When the case opened, the tech with steady hands whispered, "Hello, Trouble," and the guitar smiled in scarlet. They mounted it in a glass that didn't show fingerprints. Beneath it, a plaque with black letters that seemed to hum. Donated by Ozzy Osbourne. Beside it, a longer story that didn't try to be definitive. How could it be? The definitive story of a door is every life it lets through. Ozzy and Sharon arrived quietly, the way storms sometimes do. Sharon's jokes were gentle knives. Ozzy accepted each one with a grin and a mock-wounded heart. Jimmy shadowed nearby, juggling a dozen kindnesses no one would notice had he not made them invisible. Backstage, Roger warmed up on a Telecaster as if admitting a secret to a friend. His fingers had the patient authority of a mason rebuilding an old arch. "Feels odd," he admitted to Philip, wearing another man's early footsteps. "Feels right," Philip said. House lights flowered. A hush fell with weight. Roger stepped into it with his telly slung low, the way the blues once taught the world to carry burdens and still walk. "Good evening," he said. "I'm here because someone reminded me what music is for." He looked toward the front row. Ozzy didn't play coy. He lifted a hand. "This one's for Chuck," Roger said, "and for every kid who found a door." The opening riff of Johnny B. Good came out bright as minted coin, quick as a breath, shameless as joy. The hall stood up. People who had flown here to look at a guitar were suddenly inside a story you could dance to. Ozzy watched, eyes glassy, mouth tilted toward laughter. Sharon squeezed his hand and whispered, "All right, Prince. You did a good thing. Don't tell me," he whispered back. "Let the guitar do it." Mid-song, the screens lit with photographs. Dim basements turned into stages. Teenagers learning courage with 3 chords. Sidewalks where a riff echoed and changed the shape of afternoons. When the last note hung like a dare and then dissolved, Roger looked off stage, then back to the room. "Ozzy," he said, "come up here." Ozzy blinked, pointed at himself as if there might be another Ozzy in the building. He climbed the steps the way you climb into a clear memory. They embraced. Old lions learning, finally. There was enough savannah for both. "This man taught me that arrogance is a dead end," Roger said. "That music is a journey, not a throne." Ozzy took the mic. "We all owe Chuck Berry. Without him, I'd still be outside the fence." And fences are boring. They stood shoulder to shoulder. The audience didn't clap so much as roar. A river finding gradient. The next morning, Cleveland wore winter like it always had. Like a coat that fit. Ozzy, Sharon, Jimmy, and Philip found a diner where the coffee didn't apologize and the eggs came with opinions. Roger arrived late, hair ungovernable, eyes younger. They ordered without ceremony. "You know," Roger said, "last night felt like eating humble pie with extra slices." Ozzy salted his eggs with ecclesiastical solemnity. "Humility's where the good stuff grows." Philip nodded. "Museums are full of things people mistake for endings. They're actually beginnings with better lighting." Jimmy raised a mug. To beginnings. They visited the hall once more. The ES-335 hung in its frame of air and glass, the red no less alive in daylight. A school group wandered in, all diluted energy and high uncertain laughter. One boy stood back, hands in hoodie pockets, eyes locked on the guitar. "You play?" Ozzy asked. The boy shook his head. "Not yet." Ozzy leaned closer. "Good answer." The docent began a talk polished by 1,000 repetitions, but the boy wasn't listening. He was learning something more dangerous, that futures sometimes sit right in front of you, humming in a color you can name. A month later, a journalist with a recorder shaped like a prayer asked Roger a question about legacy. He answered without armor. "I learned that owning things isn't the same as honoring them. A man I once thought of as chaos incarnate turned out to be a better steward of meaning than I was." "And the guitar?" the journalist asked. Roger smiled. "Where it belongs. Where kids can conjugate the verb to become." When Ozzy was asked about charity and grand gestures, he shrugged the shrug of someone who had broken and been rebuilt with simpler materials. "I kept things too long that didn't love me back," he said. This one loves everybody." News stories did what news stories do, summarized a bonfire down to a match. But out beyond headlines, something subtler happened. Inspired by the donation and the tribute, small-town fundraising concerts sprung up without permission. Set lists made room for one more Barry tune. Teachers who'd stopped believing they could keep a program alive found themselves with new donors and second-hand amps that still smelled like risk. In Birmingham, an old neighbor who once owned a radio remembered a boy in a narrow street leaning toward a window he couldn't afford to open. In Oakland, a biker patched up an old guitar, put it in a kid's hands and said, "Same number of strings whether you're scared or not." In a Cleveland apartment, a 14-year-old wrote their first riff. It wasn't great. It was necessary. Roger kept his museum room at Highgate. He didn't empty it. He rewrote it. A small sign appeared near the door. Borrowed brilliance. On owning and letting go. Inside, the wall where he'd once imagined the ES-335 living remained empty by design. Visitors stopped and stared at the absence. It became the exhibit. Philip watched school groups pause there and whisper, "What's missing?" He smiled each time they answered their own question. Sometimes at closing, Roger would sit in that room without lights, the guitars around him breathing old air. He'd picture a red shape on a lakefront in Ohio, and feel grateful in a way that made the bones of his hands ache gently. Back at the hall on an ordinary afternoon that decided to become otherwise, the ES-335 reflected a face that had come to test an old theory, that music belongs to all of us, or it belongs to no one at all. A volunteer tuned a battered student guitar nearby. She looked up, saw a dad whose palms were rough from a job that paid in exhaustion, saw a kid whose desire was a soundless shout. "Want to try?" she asked. The kid nodded. The dad hesitated, then stepped back, then stepped forward again. "Go on," someone said. Someone you couldn't see clearly, someone who may have been Ozzy in an old memory or Roger in a new one, or Chuck in the Red itself. The kid pressed fingers to strings. The note that came out was the opposite of perfect. It was real. It slipped into the room and found the red guitar, and they nodded at each other like old friends who'd just met. If you stand close enough to the ES 335, you can almost hear the roads it's taken. Halls that smelled like sweat and hope. Trucks that rattled secrets loose. Motel rooms where someone realized the riff in their hands was a life raft they didn't know they were allowed to climb onto. You can hear an auction hall where a gavel discovered it could also be a bell, calling people back to meaning. You can hear two old men laughing like boys who finally found out the game wasn't winner take all. And if you listen harder, you can hear something else, the sound of a fence acquiring a door again and again wherever a hand reaches for a string. If this story stirred anything in you, if Ozzy Osbourne's choice reminded you what music is for, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Voices of Darkness and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Prove your love for Ozzy and for every kid who still believes a red guitar can be a way out and a way through. Because legends don't just make music, they make meaning.